I've owned the Fujifilm X-T4 for almost a year now, getting it for myself as a birthday gift back in April of 2021. I want to share my thoughts and opinions on this camera through a lens of someone who primarily shoots video and dabbles a bit in photography. But before we begin, allow me to introduce myself real quick. Hello, my name is Brandon, and welcome to my review of the Fujifilm X-T4. Now, I usually don't sound like this. I'm definitely down with the sickness. I have a cold, so just know that's why my voice sounds all muffled. But I won't let that stop us. This review needs to be done, even if your boy is feeling this congested. Now, mind you, I am not a super technical person, but I still will share the specs with y'all, specifically the ones that caught my attention when first initially looking at this camera. Primary resolutions and frame rates the X-T4 offers is 1080p up to 240 frames and 4K up to 60 frames. And catch this, all in 10-bit internally. Like, this little guy does all that without an external recorder. As someone being a very run and gun type of shooter, this was one of the hottest selling points for me. Now, keep in mind though, I've only shot various clips in 10-bit. This is because my computer had a hard time working with them, even when I had them as proxies. Of course, this is due to not having the latest and greatest parts in my PC, and for the sake of workflow, I've shot 8-bit a lot more with this camera, but I will be sure to include 10-bit samples for y'all, and when I do, I'll leave a label there somewhere in the clips. Regardless, the 8-bit looks amazing. In fact, we're shooting in it right now. Also, those clips you saw at the very beginning, those were shot in 8-bit. Fuji also offers a log profile for those of you who are wanting more control of your colors. It's what you're seeing now. But as for me, I stick with Eterna because I love it, and all I do is dial down the saturation and contrast a bit, and that is enough for me. As you can see in these samples, the 10-bit captures more detail overall, as seen on my skin to even the hairs on my head. You also notice this just by seeing these smoother roll-offs in the highlights and the colors just blending better all together opposed to the 8-bit. So maybe if you want to smooth out your skin, stick to 8-bit. All jokes aside, both look great. Also, I want to point out that some of you may actually prefer the 8-bit footage, which is definitely user error from me. This is because the days I shot in 10-bit was when I first got this camera and had no idea what the best ways to expose or get the right settings to ensure that I got the best image from the X-T4. So keep in mind that the samples you see here today may not be fully represented in its best potential. Alright, video autofocus. How is it exactly? It's okay. My previous camera was a Canon, and with their system, I usually could rely on the autofocus to know exactly what it was I wanted to have focus. They also had focus tracking that I absolutely miss from them. On the X-T4, there is tap to focus just like the Canon, but no tracking. And it just isn't as reliable as a modern day Canon or Sony camera, at least in terms of video autofocus. But in a studio environment like this, it has eye track autofocus, so it's able to keep up with you and you have not much going on. Once you change up the environment, there starts to be structures, leaves, different shapes moving around. It will start to struggle. So when it comes to shooting short films or for clients, I will opt shooting manual just to keep that professional look and avoid the focus hunting and breathing. IBIS, in-body image stabilization. It's a built-in stabilizer for your sensor. In the X-T4, there's 6.5 stops of IBIS. Now, I've never had a camera with IBIS, so my previous cameras only had electronic stabilization, and from viewing the footage from both, you can tell a difference, in a good and bad way. Let me explain. The corners would have a slight warp when moving, But with IBIS, it's more so like slight jerks to correct your movements. IBIS also performs very well alongside lenses with optical image stabilization, especially when it comes to shooting at longer focal lengths. So you're not getting as much warping to your image, but if it's far too much for your camera to handle, it will jerk your image. So IBIS is nice to have, but just see it as an enhancement when it comes to shooting everyday photo and video. I wanted to mention this because IBIS acts differently in every system. Specifically, in my little micro four thirds Lumix right there, the IBIS is way better than this one. In this case, with the X-T4, the IBIS performs best when shooting very casually. As always, do not expect IBIS to replace a gimbal. That's all I'm trying to say. As stated before, I am a video guy first, but that does not mean that we are going to skip this part because the photos from the X-T4 are beautiful. Being my first Fuji camera all the way from the beginning, I can say that I've always been happy with the images coming from the X-T4. I mainly shoot in standard JPEG and RAW, but I do know there are fans of Fuji that love the film simulations that Fujifilm offers in their cameras. To those of you who are primarily photographers, you'll like hearing this because the autofocus in stills actually outperforms the video autofocus. Once you have pressed that shutter, Fuji usually knows what to latch onto, whether you're using AFS or AFC. But I did notice when it comes to night or low light, it does tend to hunt a bit sometimes. So if you want to avoid that altogether, I recommend shooting in manual, just so you don't miss your shot. I don't shoot anything fast-paced, but do know that this offers up to 20 frames per second via electronic shutter and 15 frames per second via mechanical shutter, all in this 26 megapixel sensor. Having used Canon, Panasonic, and Sony in the past, having to get used to a whole new interface of dials and menus is something you'll have to learn again. Usually you'd have dials that you'd be able to access quickly, like aperture or shutter priority, but here on the Fuji, many of their lenses control aperture via lens. It's just some minor stuff you have to get used to. It's not that big of a deal for me. I mainly shoot in manual, but it's still worth acknowledging because some of that and the menus can get a little confusing. So definitely a more hands-on type of camera. Another thing I really like is this door here. Having two SD card slots available, you can either have them mirror one another, use the other as secondary storage, or in my case, I use the first slot for video and the second for stills. Another thing I really like is the switches Fuji put here, especially the focus one and the movie's still switch. Very easy and intuitive. Oh, and let's not forget the flip screen. It's actually really nice to be able to monitor yourself and see things from different angles. And if you don't have a flip screen in 2022, what are you doing exactly? Like, this is a must-have, especially nowadays. Aside from the autofocus and complicated menus, there actually isn't much to say. But I do want to point this out. This grip here, there isn't much to work with, and I'm someone with smaller hands. I can't imagine what it must feel like using this camera with bigger hands. Shutter button is placed on a flat plane, which took some getting used to, especially coming from previous systems that had a better placement of the grip and shutter button. Then again, Fuji went for the retro aesthetic, and don't get me wrong, it is a beautiful look, but comes at the cost of your fingers and hand. Overall, a year later, I am still happy with my X-T4, and I see this coming with me on my upcoming adventures, so I don't see it leaving my side anytime soon. If you're wanting to see some more footage from my X-T4, I'll be sure to leave videos at the very end screen for y'all to take a look. Thank you so much for watching and sticking it all the way to the very end here with me, despite the sickness. If I helped you out in any way or you enjoyed the video, please leave me a thumbs up. It'd mean a lot to me. I hope y'all had a very Merry Christmas, and here's to a blessed year. I'll see y'all next time. Peace.